Everybody wants negative news. That's what sells the tabloids. It's a very big problem for all of us.
So if you do not have this platform, who is going to tell your story?
Africa is not the only place where you have behavior that is either untoward or irregular. But I think we are the ones that when those allegations are made, we permit those allegations to go unchallenged.
Bad news sells is a sentence thrown around to justify the media industry's fixation on negative stories. That people are more naturally drawn to stories on corruption, disasters, killing, and the like than they are to feel-good stories is a well-known fact. Without realizing it, we are attracted to depressing stories and will readily pay rapt attention to news report of a world that is at the brink of collapse, while positive stories barely register in our consciousness. Journalists around the world know this about media consumers, and they constantly strive to meet the expectations of their target audience by feeding them one exaggerated bad news after the other. It is, after all, in line with their business model.
Because everybody wants negative news. That's what sells the tabloids. It's a very big problem for all of us. We need stories that would encourage others, for people to know that I was given birth to by a seamstress and a photographer. Then it's not the kind of photography they now embark upon, an ordinary photographer. And for you to be able to find your feet amongst your peers, we need stories of people who have climbed through the vagaries of life and have become human beings. But we don't get to hear that because those stories do not sell tabloids and they don't sell on even television. The stories that sell are the negative ones. Someone has been raped. This person has been taken out of work. This one has stolen. This one is a criminal. Those are the stories that make the rounds.
You're in the media circle, so you know how these items are treated. You cannot, or better still, let me probably give you a good example. I don't, how, you know this, how these guys view news. A couple of years ago, there was this famine in Ethiopia. The first group that came to BBC to report that it was becoming severe. The editor in charge of news that night, the chief editor, said that there was nothing. People everywhere in the world, there are so many people who are hungry. The news is, if they are dying from being hungry, then we can understand. But for me to say that there's famine in Ethiopia, there's famine all over the world. It's not only in Ethiopia. So they left it. 2 weeks later, the same reporters heard that it has become terrible. So they flew to Ethiopia, and they just saw hundreds of people dying. They recorded it, flew back, arrived in Heathrow Airport, took a helicopter to the city, and went to BBC. Met the same man and said, listen, here is it. You wanted to see people dying. Here is what you have. And the man, now this was 7 minutes to the commencement of the news. The news anchor people were in the studio. Everything was set. The intro was ready. And this guy just put in the cassette and sat down there and said, what has this guy brought to me again? When he saw the tragedy, he was alarmed. He picked up the phone and called them and said, no, we are not starting with that, what I have. Listen, we are going to put in some things and I'll be typing the commentary. You guys will be reading that. That news was under 15, 20 minutes. The whole world knew of the tragedy in Ethiopia. You understand? Now, that's the way the media works.
From the stables of the publishers Echoes Africa magazine comes your favorite TV show, Echoes from the Valley. African story like you've never seen it.
So many of these folks, they see Africa as just one country.
And the woman came to me and she goes, so what color is the flag? I said, what flag? She said, the flag of Africa. I was like, oh my God. I'm like, do I now educate this woman or do I just tell her and move on?
Recorded in locations across Africa and diaspora, it is Africa from African perspective.
These fellows invaded Africa without visas, without passports. And what about? About resources.
Echoes from the Valley on AIT, Saturdays at 7:30 a.m. It is time to tell the true African story. Present your own truth.
They are working in our psychology as Africans.
That they don't understand that it was sensationalized for, marketing purposes. But that's exactly why I think people have a misconception of Africa and African people.
That conversation about who's the most African, we're really spending a lot of time on something that really is not that significant. What's significant is what we do.
As governments, as individuals, we have got to tell our stories.
What is your African story? What is your origin and the history? What makes your culture and tradition unique? What are your milestones? Echoes from the Valley on Africa Independent Television, AIT. For sponsorship, participation, and advert details, please call the numbers on your screen. Echoes from the Valley, telling the African story. Opinions, perceptions, and mindsets are formed based on the news and stories people are constantly fed with. And while in some cases these impressions do no harm, they have been known to lead to stereotyping, misrepresentation, and misconception, which seldom result in effect on the victims.
I think Africa is a stereotype because we've not made a vigorous effort to be part of the dialogue in terms of, in most cases, what constitutes a wrongdoing, and then in most cases also who are parties to those wrongdoings. As a legal person, I'm trying to hedge my bets in terms of what I say in the answer. But what I'm actually saying is that Africa is not the only place where you have behavior that is either untoward or irregular. But I think we are the ones that when those allegations are made, we permit those allegations to go unchallenged. And if you're going to wear the hat that's put on your head, that hat is going to be there forever. In other parts of the world, the very same conduct that in our parts of the world would be called corrupt or bribery. Elsewhere they're corporate gifts. It's a corporate gift or it's a facilitation fee or something of the kind. We've been informed, if one listens, that some companies or places even used to budget for these things, to say that annually you must, if you want a particular contract or whatnot, when they come to Africa, you take all of them to these big splashy events overseas. Now, if you were to quantify all of those amounts and you're giving them to people in the hope of receiving something, it is an inducement. Right. Yet in our part of the world, we're not saying, look, what you're doing is not correct because you're technically inducing our companies to get the outcome that you want. Mm-hmm. So we're sitting quiet. So of course they're going to, when it happens in Africa, it's going to be perceived as, that is the way in which business is done in Africa. That is not the way business is done in Africa. I think it's just, we tend to be more quiet. all countries, I think, have problems which are systemic. There's nothing you can do about it. You will have wrongdoing. But I think Africa is also a country where if one looks at the recent Transparency International rankings, Namibia, I'm proud to say, we've always maintained historically a place in the top 10. Even if one looks at all African countries, I mean, for things like the rule of law, for things like the ease of doing business and those types of things apply in the bulk of African countries. So we're stereotyped because we do not try and control the narrative ourselves. One, and two, I don't think we try very hard to also defend ourselves in terms of it's not just African people doing this, but in some cases it's done to African countries. And you know, we are seen to be the beneficiary of these, yet who is the inducer? There has to be an inducer in every transaction arrangement. And I think, I mean, just, you know, talking off the cuff, that, in my view, really could, you know, be a problem in terms of why African countries could be perceived in that manner.
It just shows you the power of the media. And where we ourselves in the continent, we are not taking that too seriously. You know, I don't know how much the budget of NTA is, but if a serious government that you go to all our houses, and I, no exception, we are all either watching CNN or BBC and so on. I've gone to a friend's house once, and he told me that for months he's not listening to any Nigerian news. So if we are not listening to our own news internally, how do we tell our story externally? And we do not even have the means, and we're not even investing in it. Oh, by the way, I also knew that we came on board faster than the Chinese. But the Chinese media today, you can view any television and any network and see so many Chinese television around anywhere around the world. And that's something we have not realized. Our ministers, successful ministers and ministers for information think that propaganda and talking about what government to do, it's the way to create information for the government. No, it has not occurred to all of them that creating a powerful media that tell your story and encourage people to understand the challenges you feel is far more important than some of the things we do.
For centuries, ever since the invasion of Europeans on the soil of Africa, the continent and her people have been the victim of negative portrayal by the international media. The image of Africans painted by the first batch of European explorers were of ignorance, dumb, lesser human being who could only be put to better use as properties.
Basically, it's like, you know, having a cake on the table and you take a knife and start cutting up the cake. Now, this cake now represents Africa and each one had a piece. So, it's for the Africa issue, it was an issue which part of the cake was the creamiest. Yeah, the cream belongs to the other one belongs to, and the base, anybody can take. Yeah, Berliner Conference of 1884 simply tried to correct the situation by saying, look, you took too much, the rest what is there, can we also divide it among ourselves? And therefore Portugal, you retain these ones. Spain, in Africa, whatever you had, I do not know where they were in those days. We only hear today, Equatorial Guinea speaks Portuguese. You look at, you know, Western Sahara and so forth. The Portuguese had the rest, as we know, up to Southern Africa, Mozambique, Angola. And then the British were all over Africa, West Africa and East Africa. The French were also in West Africa and Central Africa. But the Germans were almost left out. In West Africa, they only got, you know, one, and I think Dahomey, today Togo, to Cameroon, and then they took Tanzania, Tanganyika, which is East Africa, and Southwest Africa, which is Namibia today. So for them now, this is how our borders actually, you know, started. There were no borders in Africa before that.
Because people come to this continent, they see the amount of resources in this region. They deal with Nigerians, with Kenyans, with South Africans, with Ethiopians, with Malawians. And the first thing that occurred to each and every one of them is that these people are not stupid, that these people are brilliant. Some of them went to school with people from the African region, and the Africans excelled. Not just first class, but first, two, three, top in the class. So we're actually not stupid.
From the stables of the publishers Echoes Africa magazine comes your favorite TV show, Echoes from the Valley. African story like you've never seen it.
So many of these folks, they see Africa as just one country.
And the woman came to me and she goes, so what color is the flag? I said, what flag? She said, the flag of Africa. I was like, oh my God. I'm like, do I now educate this woman or do I just tell her and move on?
Recorded in locations across Africa and diaspora, it is Africa from African perspective.
These fellows invaded Africa without visas, without passports. And what about? About resources.
Echoes from the Valley on AIT, Saturdays at 7:30 a.m. It is time to tell the true African story. Present your own truth.
They are working in our psychology as Africans.
That they don't understand that it was sensationalized for, marketing purposes. But that's exactly why I think people have a misconception of Africa and African people.
That conversation about who's the most African, we're really spending a lot of time on something that really is not that significant. What's significant is what we do.
As governments, as individuals, we have got to tell our stories.
What is your African story? What is your origin and the history? What makes your culture and tradition unique? What are your milestones? Echoes from the Valley on Africa Independent Television, AIT. For sponsorship, participation, and advert details, please call the numbers on your screen. Echoes from the Valley, telling the African story. Africa is not only blessed with bounteous mineral and natural resources, but with brilliant human resources scattered all across the globe in various fields of human endeavor, from the west to the east, the north, south, and central region of Africa. The continent's sons and daughters are excelling in their chosen fields. They, as well as the beautiful, diverse cultures, amazing landscape and resources, and the giant strides being made across the continent are all parts of African narrative that the world has chosen not to see.
Our president was in the US recently, and this question about shithole countries was asked. And because he couldn't give an appropriate answer, Donald Trump jumped into it, and to save his own neck, he said, oh, Nigeria is a beautiful country. And everybody started saying, oh, Trump has said Nigeria is a... And I had to say to someone, do you actually need Trump to tell you that your country is a beautiful country? Do you actually need him to tell you your country is a beautiful country? It just shows you again that the level of ignorance in this country as well. Because some people have not gone beyond where they were born or where they are growing up or where they are, And that's part of the problems we have in this country, that some people, because they haven't crossed the Niger or haven't crossed the Benue, they just think that that part of their own is the best, and they ignore other parts of the country. Okay, so it's the same thing with the continent. Look, this is a beautiful continent. If you travel around this continent, whether from in this country alone, we went down towards for a colleague's mother's funeral, towards the bit in Kogi. Odweri and Odo something. So you see the beautiful landscape. It was the first time, those of us who went on this journey, it was the first time, and we were all marveled at such a beautiful landscape we have in this country. You go to somewhere also in Delta on your way to Asaba, if you turn off to after Nichubu. I went again for a funeral there, and I'm trying to remember the name of the town. As you approach, you see the valleys. You know, you see the valleys and the fantastic scenery. And I'm sure all over this country, is it when you are landing, particularly now, when you are landing in Akwa Ibom, Uyo, you see the beautiful landscape, green, and the undulating rivers all over the place. I mean, you don't have to be told that this is a beautiful country. Then you go to other West African countries, you go to East African country, Kenya in particular, Kenya, you go to Tanzania towards Kilimanjaro, you know. These are all beautiful countries. Or even if you decide to get down to Cape Town, to Mombasa, to Seychelles, beautiful island. As I said, the role of the diplomat in all this is to continue to point out not just the beauty of this continent, the tremendous amount of resources. Look at just this country alone. Look at, forget the human capital of the people in the diaspora. In this country alone, I made the point that we built Abuja. Nigerians were heavily involved in the design of this city. And we're involved. Look at how beautiful it is. When you look at our financial sector, Nigerians virtually built what we have today. So you could actually, look, there's nobody who comes in here to establish a business. If you want the workers, you find, you can retrain them to what you want. The only problem is our attitude to work, is what's the problem is. But in terms of the ability to quickly grasp what you want to do, we have that capacity. The major problem, you know, when you look at it all, is just leadership. But every other thing, we've been overblessed by the Lord. There's no region that can compete with this continent when it comes to in terms of resources. And we are where we are because successive leaders have failed to develop this continent.
What's remarkable here is if you look at the United States Census, Nigerians in the United States have the highest percentage of bachelor degrees, the highest percentage of master's degrees, and the highest percentage of doctorates of any identifiable group of people. There is something you can be extraordinarily proud of. I like to say that sometimes the Nigerians have a PR problem because nobody knows these things. Nobody knows that Nollywood is like the third or second largest film business in the world, and here it's Nigeria.
The narrative of Africa will change when Africans are ready to share with the rest of the world who they are, the journey that brought them where they are, their challenges and effort being made to conquer them, and the continent's immense contribution to the world.
We need to be at the forefront. You can't tell your story from the back. You have to be at the table, you know, the metaphoric table of like who makes decisions, right? And you have to be at that table in order to tell your story. So I think people in power, people who matter, everyone matters, but we know the people, you know, the decision makers around here. Those people need to look like us. Those people need to come from African countries too. My perspective is someone who lives not in Africa, someone who lives in America, or someone who lives in England, because that's what I know. So I definitely think like people in power, people who make decisions need to look like me, because you can't ask me about my story and then retell my story. You're gonna miss some parts. Mm-hmm. You're gonna tell it wrong. You're gonna exaggerate in parts that don't, you know. So I need to tell my story. Someone else who comes from Senegal needs to tell their story. So I definitely think like if we're in the place, if we're on the table, if we're on the front lines, we'll be able to tell our stories.